All right, welcome back to the FITSNews studio, another edition of the Week in Review. But if you look around this week, if you're watching on one of our video formats, you're going to notice things are a bit sparse in here, a bit empty. Reason for that? We're moving. This is the last Week in Review that we're filming in this studio. Thanks to your support, we're going to be moving into a bigger studio here in the next couple days. We will be filming our next Week in Review from there. So I want to thank everybody who's subscribing to us and supporting us for helping us expand our operations and making that move possible. A lot to cover this week. Murdoch's saga. We've got some news out of Hilton Head where the trial lawyers got together at the Murdoch playground. Well, guess what? It's not the Murdoch playground anymore, folks. Murdoch's actually getting called out on their home turf. We're going to tell you about that. Also, we're going to walk you through some developments that are going to really pull at your heartstrings if you're a parent. We're going to talk about Gavin's Law, a piece of legislation that was passed by the South Carolina General Assembly this year involving sextortion, particularly sextortion of underage kids. The guy who is the impetus for that bill, Brandon Guffey, he sat down with us in our studios back in December, got it all started. We're going to update you on that. Very emotional segment. Be on the lookout for that. Also, political news. We've got a huge sex scandal. And if you know FITSNews, we don't really cover sex scandals. We tend to let politicians do their thing. But this one, you're not going to want to miss the reason why we address it. All that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. So last week on Hilton Head Island, right around the time we were filming the previous episode of this show, the South Carolina Association for Justice, or the group formerly known as the State Trial Lawyers Association, had gathered down on Hilton Head Island for its annual convention. Now, again, this group used to go by the name Trial Lawyers, but they changed it to Justice because, apparently Trial Lawyers doesn't really roll off the tongue. And if you're fighting for justice, the public will like you more. You get more public approval that way. But the problem with this group is it hasn't been doing much fighting for justice. In fact, it's been doing a lot of accommodation of lawyers just like Murdaugh. In fact, Murdaugh himself, Alec Murdaugh, was the president of this group as recently as 6 years ago. So we're going to talk about this group a little bit in a bit, but at this convention, which has been known across the state as the Murdoch'S Playground, the former law firm which Alec Murdaugh was a part of has reigned supreme. On the first night of this gathering every year, they called it the Judges' Dinner. Buses would pull up to the resort down on Hilton Head where they'd stayed. The judges would pile in with their wives, mistresses, you name it, and they'd all go out for this big swanky dinner paid for by Murdoch's law firm. And again, these are the judges that these lawyers appear in front of, whose favors trading back and forth. But it was called the Murdoch's Playground. And last year, Buster Murdaugh attended this event. In fact, he was on a charm offensive pushed by his father, who obviously, you can tell from all the jailhouse calls between the two of them, still has dreams of Buster one day becoming a lawyer like him, like his father, like the grandfather, great-grandfather before him. Again, generations of this family ruling that low country, 14th Judicial Circuit. Unparalleled power, unrivaled influence. Absolute power, if you will, and it, as we now know, corrupted absolutely and tragically. But at this event, where just 2 years ago Alec Murdaugh was walking as a free man, spinning the yarn about the vigilantes targeting his family. Just 2 years ago, remember that. But at this event this year, finally somebody stood up and said some things that needed to be said. The gentleman that did that is a man named O. Farrell Fur Jr. And again, that sounds like I'm singing the national anthem. O. Farrell Fur. I won't sing. But this dude, who's literally his name sounds like it's out of a 1950s Perry Mason trial, he was awarded this group's Champion of Justice honor. And again, I want you to just remember, any honor from this group, talking about justice, you want to take with an ocean of salt. But Farrell Fur stood up in receiving this honor and said some things that needed to be said. He said, and I quote, that he was embarrassed by the Murdoch'S, by Alec Murdaugh and his conduct. He said that every lawyer in the room should also be embarrassed. And he furthermore said that they all owed it to the public to restore the trust that had been lost by this guy who ripped off former clients, family members, former partners, friends, Millions of dollars. Now, again, I'm not ordinarily going to fall in for praising somebody for calling out a convicted killer, an accused multi-million-dollar fraudster. That doesn't take a lot of courage. That's not exactly a profile in courage. But in this audience, in this setting, where again the Murdoch'S literally lorded their influence over the South Carolina bar, it mattered. It mattered. Furr was congratulated by many of the attorneys in attendance at this event. But I want to be clear about something. Words are nice. Words have meaning and import. But unless there is accompanying action, they are, as King Solomon said, meaningless. So every attendee at that bar, and I want to challenge all of them, whether you're on the plaintiff's side, whether you're on the defendant's side, you have a deficit of public trust right now. You have a corrupt system that desperately needs to be reformed, and you're either going to be on the side of fixing it or not fixing it. You're going to be on the side of actual justice or the continuing accommodation of a system that clearly did not produce it. Anyway, as we move on, we're clearly in the accountability phase of the Murdaugh saga, as evidenced not only by the criminal trial of Alec Murdaugh and the federal criminal trial of Russell Laffitte, but also what we're seeing in these civil cases and in the belated acknowledgement from the justice lawyers down there in Hilton Head that, yes, something was rotten in the state of South Carolina. But as we continue in this accountability phase, there are other names that are now cropping up, and we heard this week about one of those names. I'm talking about Corey Fleming. Fleming, of course, an attorney from Beaufort, South Carolina, a longtime friend of Alec Murdaugh. Those of you who followed the double homicide trial in Colleton, you remember Corey Fleming was the guy on the tape when Alec Murdaugh was first confronted by law enforcement, first confronted by the news that his alibi was no good, that the gig was up, that they were zeroing in on him as a target. But Fleming has been implicated in several of Murdoch's alleged fleecings, most specifically the one he's been criminally charged in, the fraud emanating from the death of former Murdaugh housekeeper Gloria Satterfield. Fleming is facing both state and federal charges, and in fact, the disposition of those charges has created something of a war between the prosecutors on these cases, both the state and the feds. Now, Fleming has rushed to the feds. His attorney, Debbie Barbier, she is one of the best in the business, folks. Former prosecutor. She has been involved in multiple high-profile cases. But Debbie Barbier appeared in court this week with her client and with prosecutors from the state for a status hearing. Now, I got to talk about this status hearing because we found out about it literally at the last minute, an hour before it took place. And there were only two reporters in that courtroom, me and Joe Bustos from the state newspaper. And by the way, they found out because we called them just to see if they'd heard anything about it. That's unacceptable. That's unacceptable. And I want everyone on here to know we spoke with the Attorney General's office this week. And in fact, I called the AG personally. He's been on this set. We know him. And communicated very clearly, this can't happen. This can't happen. I know that the attention of the world is not surrounding this case quite the way it did down in Colleton County back in March of this year when every international media outlet was on the steps of the courthouse there in Walterboro, South Carolina. But these are still significant cases with significant repercussions, not only for the victims involved, but again, for that bigger picture of justice. We've, from the beginning, called this the crime and corruption saga, people. And until we root out all of that corruption, how can we have faith in that justice system? So this last-minute hearing, this hearing which got no public notification, well, again, we were the only ones in the room other than Mr. Bustos from the state. So what did we find out? Well, didn't seem like a lot. But when we started peeling back the layers in our coverage on FITSNews.com, we noted there were some potentially very significant developments to come out of that hearing. First and foremost, a plea deal between state prosecutors and one of the Murdaugh defendants that is linked to this Cowboys gang down in Walterboro, South Carolina. And if you hadn't been following this story from the beginning, it's not just financial crimes, people. It's not just graphic murders. There's a big drug investigation tied to this. There's potentially a big gambling investigation tied to this. And last August, there was a big raid in Colleton County on some of the targets of those investigations who have ties to Alec Murdaugh, who've gotten tens of thousands of dollars from Alec Murdaugh. That's right. And if you go back to our double homicide trial, remember, this was a circumstantial case, no guns. Did Alec Murdaugh have help? People have asked that over and over again. And when we start looking at these drug cases, it is only natural to ask yourself, could some of these people or some of their associates potentially have been involved? So any plea deal involving these defendants is potentially very significant. So I went up to lead prosecutor Creighton Waters after this hearing. Creighton Waters argued in front of Judge Clifton Newman, again in front of nobody because the press didn't know. But he argued in front of Judge Newman that the state had an agreement in principle with defendant Jerry Rivers, 40 years old, out of Walterboro, a little over 6 feet, weighing in at a burly 400 pounds. Don't end up in a cell alone with that guy, folks. But an agreement in principle with the state. Now, Waters made clear that nothing's official until, quote, everyone comes to the altar. But if a plea agreement is reached with Mr. Rivers, that would mean his trial scheduled for August 28 of this year would be off. Now, I asked Creighton Waters afterward, I said, Mr. Prosecutor, can you tell us about this deal? Particularly, can you tell us what sort of cooperation agreement did Mr. Rivers enter into with your office regarding other defendants? Well, Mr. Waters wasn't very forthcoming, and I understand that. He's got an investigation to run. But he did say to anticipate more meat on the bone regarding this plea in future hearings. Well, folks, let's just hope we get advised to those future hearings so that they don't happen in the dark. Again, this is way too big a case to have any sort of effectively closed-door hearings. And so we will stay on the Attorney General's office to do a much better job of advising the public on those matters. Now, one other thing before we get off the Murdaugh subject here. There were some developments this week regarding Alec Murdoch's assets. Now, this has been a subject of tremendous skepticism, scrutiny, questioning over the last few months. How much money does Alec Murdaugh have? Where did the millions of dollars he stole ultimately go? Our Jen Wood has been working tirelessly on a big report that's coming. Be on the lookout for that in the next few weeks as Jen Wood has been doing a deep dive into those finances. But for the time being, we got a number this week, folks, $1.7 million. $1.7 million, that's the money Murdaugh has. Actually a little more than that. It's $2.1 million, but a big chunk of that has been asked for by the receivers, the attorneys who have been diligently going through all of the claims against Murdaugh and trying to identify and liquidate all of his assets. But $1.7 million against claims, potentially, of more than $26 million. Yeah. That's not going to square. That math isn't going to add up. I was born in South Carolina and educated in a South Carolina government-run school, but I know that math doesn't add up. There's going to be more money sought from Alec Murdaugh than Alec Murdaugh will ever have to pay out. But that process, folks, it is going to be a free-for-all. The receivers in this case, who again, way back in 2021, were tasked with managing Alec Murdaugh's assets while all these claims were filed, they've done a very diligent job. John Lay and Peter McCoy, big props to those two attorneys for the work they've done. But this is going to be a free-for-all. These claims are going to come in. There's going to be hearings on these claims. And let's not forget, Murdaugh has already confessed judgment in the amount of $4.3 million, more than twice what he currently has in that receivership. Already confessed that judgment to attorneys Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter. Now, there's been some controversy about that. The lawyers for Murdaugh claimed that this was part of unethical conduct. Again, we're going to let that battle play out in court, but we will note that just this past week, an attempt to toss that confession of judgment was itself tossed, which means that as of right now, that document still stands, which means Bland and Richter would have the upper hand, it would appear, regarding the liquidation of those accounts. The boss once said, folks, sooner or later, It all comes down to money. Bruce Springsteen on the album Lucky Town, if I'm not mistaken. Sooner or later, it all comes down to money. And in the Murdaugh case, we are finally, at long last, beginning to have an accounting of that money and where it may end up as it relates to the victims. But the bigger picture, where did all the stolen money go? Again, keep it tuned to FITSNews.com as our Jen Wood digs into that. And once again, keep it tuned to FITSNews.com for all the latest on this ongoing, still unraveling, still unfolding crime and corruption saga as we seek to enforce and do our part to hold everyone involved in the crime and corruption saga accountable. So if you follow this news outlet for any amount of time, you know I'm a husband, I'm a dad, actually have 7 kids. That's right, not even Catholic or Mormon. And yes, we have a massive television in the bedroom, so go figure. Maybe it's turning the TV on. Maybe that would work. But anyway, having kids changes your perspective on things. And I've got kids who are teens. I've got kids who are tweens. I've got kids who are still little. So we run the whole gamut of the parental experience. But oftentimes there's things I cover that impact how I think as a father. And oftentimes there's things I see as a father that impact what I do as a reporter. I think that's only natural. But this past week, we ran a story that I actually stopped and talked about to my kids. It's a story that started actually in this studio many, many months ago, back in late December of last year. It involves an individual by the name of Brandon Guffey. Brandon is a state representative, was just recently elected last year from the people of York County. And Brandon came and spoke to me. I'd never met Brandon before he ran, never really followed his campaign. But I did come to find out that while he was running, his family suffered just an unspeakable tragedy. His eldest son, Gavin Guffey, on a summer evening in 2022, took his own life. And Gavin Guffey made that decision because he was the victim of a sextortion scam. Specifically, someone that he thought was an attractive young woman had reached out to him, flirted with him. And on the fateful night when he took his life, he had taken a break from hanging with his friends to engage with this person he thought was interested in and loved him. And he made the mistake of sending an illicit image. And the second that happened, this anonymous sender flipped the script, threatened to send that picture to all of Guffey's family, to his friends. And Guffey was so scared, so mortified of that potential embarrassment, that he made that decision to take his own life. His dad came on this set months ago on a mission, a man on a mission. Talked about the need to fix South Carolina's laws regarding sextortion, to strengthen them, toughen the penalties for people who do this, and he was successful. Just this year, Gavin's Law, named after Gavin Guffey, was signed. 20 years, people. 20 years, felony, for any sextortion resulting in death or great bodily injury as a proximate cause. Now, why does this matter? And why should you talk to your kids about it if you have kids? Well, I don't know if you know, these things that we carry around our lives on these phones, these devices, 2 of my kids have them. All of my kids want them. But there's poison in these things, people. There is toxicity. And if you're unaware of what your kids might be up to, if you're unaware of what they might be exposed to, if you're unaware of what they might be exposing, then you need to take this story seriously. One of the things that struck out in Brandon Guffey's column, he had a quote that has stuck with me. And it's something that I told my kids the other night, the ones that were old enough to talk about this stuff. Brandon Guffey wrote on our site, "No shame is worth taking your life. No shame." And I thought about that because we've all done stuff that, if the world knew, would embarrass us, would make us want to die. But the lesson of this story is not just that we've got a better law now to protect people from this sort of thing, but it's that mission that Brandon Guffey has been on from the very moment that he held his son. He talked about it in the column, holding his son in his arms as he died. Can't even imagine something like that. Can't even imagine something like that. But the mission he's been on ever since that moment, when his son literally died in his arms, it's bigger than just a law. It's about conversations like this. It's about conversations with your kids about what they're doing on these devices. Because we don't know. We don't know. But I want to say something about this, because this is one of the reasons that we're here. This is one of the reasons that we do what we do. We talk a lot about these big political issues. We talk a lot about crime and courts. But affecting real change, because Brandon Guffey told me, he said, listen, you guys were one of the first ones to sit down, and he said, and after you guys, it was everywhere. All the media picked up on it. And that's what this is about. Spreading those messages to let everybody know that no matter what you've done, it's not worth ending your life over. And I would encourage anybody who's watching this with kids, talk to your kids and convey that message. No shame is ever so bad that it's worth taking your life. And also, if you are somebody who's ever thought about suicide or harming yourself, just know that there is help. 988. They made it real simple. That's one of the good things about these things, is it is simpler to get help. 988, just dial it on your phone. Folks are there 24/7, 365 to talk. And if you don't want to do that, call a friend, call a family member. But just remember, you're never alone, and there's always hope. But I want to thank Representative Brandon Guffey for turning his personal tragedy into that mission, for letting us tell his story, and for the continued work that he is doing to make sure that no other family has to experience the tragedy that his family endured. So for our last segment, we're going to delve into some lighter fare, South Carolina politics, which, of course, if you follow politics in the Palmetto State, you know that there's no shortage of fodder from our Palmetto politicians. They are routinely giving us all sorts of good stuff to work with as it relates to their disastrous personal lives. But here's the thing. At FITSNews, we try not to veer into that world. We try to stay out of the realm of politicians' personal lives. Unless they're wasting tax money or abusing their power, or unless there's some associated criminality or just over-the-top hypocrisy, we tend to let them kind of do what they do in their own personal life, because, again, that's really not much of our business unless they make it our business. And the story of William Timmons, the congressman from the social conservative buckle of the Bible Belt up there in Greenville, South Carolina, this third-term fortunate son from a fifth-generation powerhouse family, uber wealthy, uber influential, but all that money apparently hasn't bought much in the way of class for William Timmons. I wrote in a big column this week that this guy was born halfway to home plate and thought he hit a home run in the World Series. And that kind of sums this guy up. He's a little bit of an entitled, what's the word I'm looking for? Let's go with douchebag. How about that? Let's just throw that one out there, because I think that actually might be kind commentary when you go back and look at this past week for William Timmons. Now, I want to walk you through this story. Last spring, this news outlet was forwarded an unsolicited 18-word statement from Timmons asking for prayers and privacy as he and his wife went through a difficult private matter. Now, again, everybody that works for William Timmons knows how this news outlet covers political sex scandals, which is we really don't cover them. Well, unless we're in them. Shudder to think what Dylan's putting up on the screen right now. But seriously, we don't go there. And they knew that. And they also knew that not only did we not ask for a statement, that at no point in time did we indicate we had any intention to cover Timmons' affair, because we didn't. It's simply not a story I would have covered. But Timmons' statement pushed this story out there, and the more that we've learned about it, it appears that that was by design. It seems that Congressman Timmons no longer wanted to be married to Mrs. Timmons, and that a sex scandal in the media, well, that was just the ticket to sell his family and constituents on the notion that he was leaving his wife. And they were, by the way, separated last fall, or divorced, rather. But this week we've come to learn that as we dug into this story, which again was literally pushed on us by Timmons, what we've learned is that there's a lot more to this than just an affair. There's a lot more to this than just politicians sending nasty pictures and nastier imaginings to their paramours. What we've learned is that this story has some characters and some real consequences. In fact, one of the stories we've uncovered tied to William Timmons' mistress, Paula Dyer. She bills herself as a socialite from the South Carolina upstate. We'll just refer to her as a self-described socialite. But Paula Dyer has been involved in several other entanglements. William Timmons isn't the only one. In fact, one of those entanglements ended with the death of a woman down in Mexico. And we hinted at this in our coverage, and we're going to be talking more about this story in the weeks and months to come. But this was a death that, according to our sources, is still under investigation by the Mexican authorities. It's believed to be a death by suicide, but there are questions related to it. And there are communications from this poor woman hours before she passed away, possibly took her own life again. We don't know all the circumstances. But people dying is pretty significant, folks. But there's other things around this. There was a huge land grant made by Timmons to his wife just before this scandal broke. Was that a bid to buy her silence? There's the fact that Timmons is allegedly subsidizing his mistress's child custody case and divorce case against wealthy upstate developer Ron Rawlis. There are allegations that it was Timmons who abused his position of authority to get Rawlis thrown in jail for 3 months on a contempt charge, literally put in jail with a murderer for 3 months, and allegations that attempts were made to bribe Rawlis to back off so that he would get out of jail early. Rawlis said hell no. He served his 90 days, every last day, in the cell with a murderer. And we'll talk more about that, too, in future episodes. But here's the other thing. We've been talking about phones a lot this episode. Timmons used his phone to send threatening messages, in this case, to Rawlis. So it's not just an affair. And beyond all this, we've got the fact that Timmons' mistress is represented by none other than the Ways and Means Chairman of the South Carolina House of Representatives, a very powerful guy named Bruce Bannister. A guy who has a lot of pull, who could trade a lot of favors, who's very integral in the selection and election of judges here in the Palmetto State. You think any of this is happening by accident? Now, we cover all this. The mainstream media up there won't touch it. They're afraid. They'll cover it when William Timmons goes on the radio to talk trash about us as a gutter gossip site or a tabloid. They'll cover that. Washington Post got backed down by Timmons' lawyers because they were digging into the same reports we've heard, that there is a taxpayer component to this story, and that the U.S. House Ethics Committee was, in fact, beginning an investigation into that before Republicans took control of the House back in January. Again, this isn't just about an affair. And it isn't just about tawdry pictures, although if you're following this on the YouTube and not the podcast, by the way, if you're listening on the podcast, God bless you, but you might want to check this one out on the YouTube right now because there's pictures. And again, we went out of our way to make sure that we handled that as discreetly as possible because, we're not in the business of, well, maybe I'm in the business, but we won't we won't talk about that on the show. But what we will talk about is, again, the notion of public trust and a powerful elected official, not only at the heart of this sex scandal, but the lawyer representing the mistress, these things are important. And when someone's dead, when someone's been thrown in jail for 30 days with a murder, when you've got alleged threats and potential improper manipulation of the court system, again, it's not just about an affair. So I want you to know something. This news outlet, our microphone's always open to Timmons attorneys. We'll sit down with him. We'll treat him fairly. We'll let him tell his side of the story. But that would require him summoning a sack, people. That would require him to stop hiding behind his whiny radio appearances and threats he's been making privately to people up there in Greenville, trying to throw the muscle of a family name around that, frankly, he did nothing to build and is doing everything to burn down. And by the way, William Timmons, I spoke with my lawyer, Bakari Sellers, before we aired this show. And if you want to jump and if you feel froggy, he's more than willing to accept service on any action you want to bring. We look forward to sitting down with you in depositions, my friend. Or we can do it the right way. You can come sit on our set and let's hash it out. Let's tell your side of this story. Anyway, the invite's open, bud. You know where to find us. Now, there's also some additional congressional news, and I want to talk about this because we've been the tip of the spear on the Timmons soap opera. But we've also been writing recently about a South Carolina member of Congress who isn't looking at the business end of a career implosion. One member of the South Carolina Congressional delegation is actually on the way up in a big way, and I'm talking about Nancy Mace. Now, Nancy Mace is a former business partner of mine, full disclosure. She was actually a part owner of this website back in the early teens. Bought her out right before she ran against U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham. She was unsuccessful in that race, but in 2020, she won a congressional seat, and in 2022 was reelected. And that reelection is significant because Nancy Mace was projected to be in a dogfight. She was in a fierce primary where Donald Trump actually endorsed her opponent. So the base was very badly divided on the Republican side. She was running against a very well-funded Democratic challenger. And oh, by the way, the abortion issue went nuts that election cycle. Millions of dollars flowing into this district from pro-abortion groups, attacking Nancy Mace on that issue. She won by 14 percentage points, people. A landslide. She flipped 40% of districts that had gone Democratic in the previous election. She won deep blue Charleston County, which is about as woke as they come thanks to the liberal rag down there, the Post and Courier. She won Charleston County by 4.5%. Basically a deep purple district. She won going away. So our sources have been telling us that folks down in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, who previously had some beef with Nancy Mace, starting to take a different view of the Congresswoman. Starting to look at her and say, wait a minute, this is something we might need to bottle for our 2024 bid. And others on the presidential prospect list looking at Nancy Mace as a potential vice president. But, everybody said, oh, well, Will, you used to work with her, you like her. Well, actually, we've been pretty damn critical of Mace in recent years. In fact, she flip-flopped a lot in the aftermath of the January 6th riots. I called her out pretty aggressively. And we'll continue to do so if that sort of flip-floppery comes back. But no, it wasn't just FITSNews talking about it. It turns out that after our speculation about Nancy Mace as a potential vice presidential candidate, guess who chimed in? Wall Street Journal, people. Article dropped just this past week listing Nancy Mace as one of the short list possibilities for Trump and for potentially any other Republican with the nomination. And by the way, I don't see any way Trump isn't the nominee at this point. I mean, he's the runaway leader nationally in South Carolina and New Hampshire, Iowa. Love him, hate him. Whatever you think of the man is the presumptive Republican nominee at this point and has absolutely got Nancy Mace on his list as he looks at potential vice presidential prospects. Now, would she take the job? I don't know. Mace has said she'll have that discussion when the time is right. We'll see. But definitely night and day if you look at this South Carolina Congressional delegation. You got some that are kind of swirling in the drain right now and some that are literally strapped to that rocket heading good places. But you know the thing about Palmetto politics, people, it can turn on a dime. Momentum is a fickle mistress. And if you want to know who to follow in South Carolina politics, where to invest your political capital, I would encourage you to tune in every Sunday morning. We drop a little segment called the Palmetto Political Stock Index. It's compiled by myself, by Mark Powell, one of our contributing authors. We go through all the big developments each week. Whose stock is rising, whose stock is falling, whose stock is holding. Or in the case of William Timmons, whose stock is trading on some less than savory South American exchanges, no doubt. But you can track all that in that Palmetto Political Stock Index. And again, don't ever forget FITSNews. Yeah, we break a lot of news. We cover a lot of big crime and court sagas, launching a lot of big podcasts, doing a lot of big things. But we are first and foremost, always have been, that political site first in the South. So keep it tuned to FITSNews.com for all your Palmetto political needs. All right, that is a wrap for this week's edition of the Week in Review, the last one again from our current studio. Cannot wait to film the first episode next week in our new location. By the way, while I'm going through some items for the checklist here, I want to remind everybody, if you haven't already subscribed to Fitz Files, check it out on Apple, Spotify, on Google. Fitz Files, our new true crime podcast. Be sure not to miss that. But I wanted to tell you today about another series that we've just launched. It's called Unsolved Carolinas, and this is all the work of our research director, Jen Wood. And I want to tell you just real quickly how that started. During the big Long Island serial killer case, when that first broke last month and everyone's scouring for the South Carolina connection and potential victims, Jen Wood noticed something. She noticed that there were victims that didn't fit the description of the Long Island serial killer's targets. And she felt, you know what, these missing persons, unsolved murders, their stories need to be told too. So Jen Wood, along with support from Callie Lyons, our assistant researcher, they have put together a great new format. We're going to be rolling these out over the weeks to come. Stories that need to be told about unsolved murders and missing cases that have really disappeared from the radar. Unsolved Carolinas, check that out on FITSNews. Last but not least, I was told that we would have some bad consequences for me from my boss, the wife, Katrina Folks, our CEO, if I didn't mention this. So I do want to throw this out there. This new studio, the new reporters that we've brought on, all of this is only possible because of your support. It's because of subscribers like you who go to FITSNews.com, pay that $8 a month. I know time's tight these days, but $8 a month to support the accountability, to support the investigations we do, to buy the equipment, to pay the reporters. That helps us tell these stories, and it helps us insist on the accountability that we've been talking about from the beginning. In this episode, all the previous episodes, it's your subscription that helps us do it. So if you can, please go to FITSNews.com and subscribe today. And we'll catch you on the next Week in Review.